There was always an issue. The bottle manufacturer didn't show up, or, we had a problem with the brewing, or there was a hurricane, or we missed the ship, whatever it was.
On this episode of Executive Edge, Greg is joined by John Hellriegel, a Rutgers professor and former supply chain executive.
What were the issues? Why was the bottler producing late?
So we did all of that work, and we grew the brand by 30% in a year. Just boom. It was amazing. I was used to sort of just ordering the beer, optimizing my plans in the US and letting my partners do their thing.
So it sounds like you really dove into what I'd call the system more, right? Your function, your portion of it. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest episode of the Executive Edge podcast. My name is Greg Anderson with Tenzing, and I'm very happy today to have an old friend on the show as our guest today. John Hellriegel is a supply chain expert with almost 4 decades of experience. John has worked for companies such as Estée Lauder, Diageo, Honeywell, Pepperidge Farm, Accenture, and GE throughout his career. And he is now a professor at Rutgers University. So we're going to explore that as well. That's a big shift in career. But John has got a lot of deep experience in all things supply chain, especially demand planning, inventory optimization, distribution planning, capacities planning, materials management, you name it. John's very passionate about developing people into being great leaders, and I believe that's probably one of the reasons he went into academia. But without further ado, allow me to introduce John Hellriegel. John, it's great to have you here today with us. Thank you.
It's great to be here, Greg.
Yeah. So I was going back to when we met before I got ready for this today, and I said, wow, we've known each other 18 years. And I met you when you were working at Honeywell in the ACS division of Honeywell.
Yep.
Do you recall that?
Oh yeah. We were good partners. We had some great solutions for the business, and you came in with the ideas, solutions. I was there to help broker that and sell it internally, and a lot of fun.
Yeah. So one trip I remember is when we went barnstorming through Europe. That was great. Going around talking to some business leaders about inventory optimization, what our plans were. So thanks for always being a great partner as well as a client. And let's talk about your early career first here today. I think you have a lot that our audience, I think, can learn from in terms of working in the supply chain function. So I want to give it to you here and say, maybe start out with one of your earlier stories early in your career as you were learning about supply chain, and maybe share some of the experiences you had here you think would be valuable for the audience.
Sure. I mean, and by the way, every experience is an opportunity to learn, right? So, even coming out of school, I was an electrical engineer working at GE Aerospace. I was on a shop floor. Boy, I was a terrible engineer, but, I actually manufacturing seemed to be okay, and so from there I went to Accenture, and supply chain was just becoming a thing. So I got a chance to, see lots of great companies, work at Harley Davidson, work for Kodak, which doesn't even exist anymore, right? So kind of, you think about all those things, but there are definitely a couple of things that just sort of stick out, right? I started after Accenture, I went to Pepperidge Farm, and I was actually a supply chain systems manager. And then they wanted to start up a demand planning group. And I was like, yeah, of course, hopefully, your career gets a chance to try new things and really dig in. So that was always my mindset. I had a computer with Excel on it. I had some data about the sales, right? And I had an intern, and that was for almost $1 billion business. So it really makes you think differently, right? Not just, okay, here's my tool, here's my inputs, here's how I run the process, but what's important? How do you actually get value out of this process? What's important for, someone who's making a decision about production, or how do you improve service? So, some opportunities like that, you're really lucky, it's fun to have those challenges in a very different way.
And I imagine at Pepperidge Farm, there has to be a massive amount of seasonality, especially around those square cakes they made. I love those cakes, by the way.
Oh yeah, Downingtown, Pennsylvania. I think they're still made there today, right? So yeah, I mean, the frozen, each product family is different, right? Frozen cakes, very different from stuffing, which obviously, you got that huge seasonal mountain in Thanksgiving time frame, right? But then each family was different, right? So Milano cookies, I forecast the Milano cookies. I love to eat them. I love to forecast them. And they had, promotions was the big driver, a bit of trend, a bit of seasonality, but promotions, right? So again, you have to tailor that approach to that versus Goldfish, which is, has lots of different things from, what's going on with the different retailers, how much inventory they're holding, big events like Super Bowl and what kind of promotional dollars you're putting in there. So yeah, it's fun to kind of also, be passionate about the products you're with, right? And so, I love food. I love the cookies. I love the Goldfish, all that stuff, and got a chance to plan them too.
Great. And then you went on to Diageo after that, right?
I did, yeah. So I was the director of supply for beer, right? Which is like the dream title. My friends would say, "How could you even leave that job?" Right? And I said, "Well, I didn't leave beer. I still enjoy Guinness, right? But that was really great too. Had a chance to work, with great brands like Guinness, Harp, Red Stripe. We did Smirnoff Ice as well. But also, again, it's the funny stories that you sort of remember, like on the Red Stripe brand, for example. We had trying to compete as a summertime beer against Corona. We had some great marketing plans. Hooray beer! You can look that one up. I remember you, Greg. You probably remember that one, right?
For
But
sure.
right, but problem was our supply chain coming from Jamaica into the U.S. was pretty broken, right? And there was always an issue. Hey, guess what? The bottle manufacturer didn't show up, or we had a problem with the brewing, or there was a hurricane, or we missed the ship, whatever it was. And I remember talking with the one of the head from Red Stripe in Jamaica, and he says, we got to fix this. I'm like, yeah, we got to fix this. And what I didn't tell him was, our marketing team was even saying, hey, look, should we be brewing this elsewhere?
Right.
And so he said, what we're going to do, John? He said, we're going to have a come to Jesus meeting. I was like, what's that? And he's like, well, look, we're going to bring everybody in. Their past sins are forgiven, and we're going to figure out how to move forward on all this stuff, right? So, we worked on, okay, bottles are an issue. Hey, let's get a right safety stock going in there, right? We want to work on, brewing. Let's bring some brewing experts. We have folks in Guinness. We had folks in Canada, Ireland. Bring them in to help out, right? We're going to talk about, getting the right plans and the right, production. Get that. Logistics, get that. So we did all of that work, and like we grew the brand by like 30% in a year. Just boom, right? Just getting all that right. And obviously communicating, with each other. It was amazing. It's one of those things where I was used to sort of just ordering the beer, optimizing my plans in the US and letting my partners do their thing, right? And what I realized was, well, that can work, but when you have issues, you can just blame your supplier, you can blame other people, or you can dig in and actually work with them. And we did. I mean, we spent a lot of time working on it, but I mean, the brand grew tremendously. I mean, it was one of the areas I'm really proud of, right? Just having that, not just doing my thing well, but working together as a team.
So it sounds like you really dove into what I'd call the system more, right? Than just, your function, your portion of it, and sort of counting on everybody else. But it sounded like you had to go learn what were the issues. Why was the
Yeah.
bottler
Yeah, well,
producing late?
it's
Right.
easy to say, okay, the supply chain is as strong as its weakest link, right? Everybody knows that. You can sort of say that as a platitude, but what does
Yep.
that mean, right? Well, how do you help that link be stronger, right? And you know, at the end of the day, you know, supply chains are complex, lots of stuff going on. So it's like, you may not think about your supplier's supplier. In this case, was bottles that they were getting from someone else, right? But you know, what's that liability? Like how much inventory do they need to protect themselves against that reliability? And by the way, they're on an island, right? So I get it, right? But
Right.
it definitely broadened my perspective on, not just doing my job well, but actually making sure that the whole system worked.
Yeah. Yeah. So you were in food and beverage there with Pepperidge Farm and Diageo, and then I believe after that you went into Honeywell.
Yep.
And was that, a pretty big change? I mean, I can imagine Honeywell had a lot more sophistication potentially around planning, and you're looking at, a whole different product line now. So how did you make that adjustment?
Yeah. I mean, I would tell you that, supply chains to me a lot, so much more that are similar than they are different, I
Uh-huh.
mean, creating forecasts, trying to get production plans, distribution plans, material, all that stuff, roughly works the same for most industries. Obviously, Honeywell had some stuff which was like project-based businesses where, you can't just forecast trends. You have to sort of look at sales pipelines and stuff. But, the transition was actually pretty straightforward. And for me, again, like I grew up as an engineer, right? So like having a little structured mind,
Mm.
that actually worked pretty well with Honeywell. They were all that way too, Going to Estee Lauder later was a little different. That was more of a culture shock, but no, Honeywell was fun. Basically, I worked a lot as almost like an internal consultant, right? So, we would say, okay, how's your supply chain? How in relation to the business? What's going on? And then, how do we find those solutions that improve, right? And then, part of that is also not just, saying here's an idea, but actually, how do you make that change stick? How do you get people to buy in, right? So, I mean, Greg, we did this together, right? We talked about, getting an inventory optimization tool into Honeywell, right? And
Right.
so at the high level, it was like, okay, talking to the executives, I remember you and I were in some rooms and people were saying, well, you got enough inventory, but you don't have it on the right items. Your mix isn't right. So what do we have to do? Remember
Fix the
that old
mix.
fix the mix. Exactly right. So we had to fix the mix. And guess what? People could go, okay, I get that, right? I understand that. But then, like, we did some stuff. It's like, okay, well, by the way, we're talking about multi-echelon inventory optimization, and the whole idea is, you don't have to have perfect service in the interim steps in your supply chain, but you're with your customer, you have to have the service. That's where it counts. That's
Sure.
a little harder to get around, right? It's harder to get your mind around it. So, guess what? You and I, we did road shows, we did proof of concepts. We actually took people's data and showed them what it was going to look like, and then the light bulb goes off and people adopted it, right?
Right, right. Maybe a little bit for our listeners here. A couple of things about this. You're triggering me. There's often double buffers of inventory when you have a central distribution center feeding more customer facing warehouses. And that's really what we were helping to do, is to say, let's pool the variation in demand across those customer facing places and keep the right amount of safety stock in the system, but find the right place to keep it, right? You keep it close or you keep it back at the central, and you kind of pool the variation and wash it out there. And, there were some big challenges because our solution was a bit like a black box, and it would spit out some answers that were dramatically lower safety stock positions than what our clients were used to using. And so we literally would, and I'm sure that we did this at Honeywell, was kind of step people down toward that target, right? Don't go all the way to the target. Let's make sure we don't have any service issues, and sort of incrementally work our way down there and ultimately prove out the concept of looking at that multi-echelon system in a different way. So that was cool. The other thing I took away from there, and I remember this, we were in Golden Valley doing the pitch like you just talked about,
Yeah.
and there was a guy there, and we were talking about, well, this tool, this solution can really help you to make smarter decisions, and it's really taking into account a lot of things and doing some really advanced stochastic calculations. And a guy said to me, he goes, Greg, our people need to know how to use it, though. A fool with a tool is still a fool.
Right,
And
right.
that stuck with me. That stuck with me. And really, it's not just, you can't just bring in any kind of technology or any software, I don't care where you are in the supply chain, and it's going to fix things. People need to know how to use it and to apply it properly, right? And
Yeah.
that's still true today with AI, right?
Oh my
So
gosh.
so
Yeah.
that was a great experience working with you there. And then you went to Estee Lauder, and maybe give me a story or two about that. What sort of items were you planning and working on demand with at Estee Lauder?
Yeah. So, I mean, by the way, very big culture shock, right? So, just culturally great company. I mean, really fun place to work. Tremendous people that I keep in touch with, to this day. But very big culture shock. But, you know, and by the way, I know more about foundation and concealer and lipstick and lip liner and blush than I ever thought, right? So, So I started in demand planning, which is a great place to learn a business, right? Because you're talking about the products, you're talking with sales and marketing and finance and supply chain about, what's selling and why, and you're trying to back it up with data. It was great. I mean, in contrast to Pepperidge Farm, right, where there was nothing, right? I walked into a large team, advanced tools, reporting, things like that. Not perfect, but well established. But there's lots of things that you still can learn, right? Sometimes it's, hey, you know what? We're looking at MAC, which is a beauty brand, right? They had lipstick and they're changing their lipstick, in and out all the time, right? So we're trying to forecast at the SKU level, right? And guess what? It's pretty confusing and the trends are changing a lot. Sorry about that. But then, actually, we tried something different. Let's go up from the item level to the family level to the category level, right? And just about every demand planning tool has that ability to do hierarchies. And guess what? At the category level, completely stable, perfectly forecastable, right? So
Right.
rather than try to build up a forecast from all these SKUs, we forecasted that top level. We knew that was the right answer. And then we would really just spend our time doing some disaggregation, right? So, well, this is a new family that's coming in. What share is it going to take, right? And what's the cannibalization for the other ones? And then, when you get within a family, okay, well, how do I get to the item? And then usually, there's some great tools that sort of look at historical splits and things. Great stuff, So,
Right.
so sometimes it's a technique, right? And other times, it's the people that you're working with in the business that makes a difference, right? I mean, so, I think you and I both believe, right, that the supply chain supports the business, right? It's not the other way around. But I remember, talking with the general manager from Estee Lauder, right? So this woman, very sharp woman, really great, dedicated, knew the products well, but she reported to the Lauder family, right? If the sales weren't great, she had to explain to Jane Lauder why things weren't going so well. So,
Mm.
you knew there was a tremendous pressure there, right? And so I remember she wasn't, my demand planning lead wasn't getting along with her and stuff. And we sat down and I said, look, like, I'm here to support you, number one, right? Number two, like, I'm going to advise you to make the best data-driven decisions that you can, right? But I understand that maybe you can't make that decision, right? You can't say that holiday is going to be flat over last year, right? And you have to call it X%, right? I'm going to tell you what I see and what the data and the insights and our tools are telling us. But if you go against it, I understand that, right? And supply chain people don't usually understand that. Like, hey, you got to forecast accurately. We got to try and get the perfect supply chain response. But business doesn't always work like that. And as soon as we had that relationship where, hey, I'm your advisor, I work for you to make your brand successful, right? Estee Lauder's on my paycheck, Estee Lauder's on your paycheck. Let's work on that. Oh my gosh, the conversations became so much more productive.
Yeah.
And even when we disagreed or something like that, we all knew the intentions that we were trying to follow, and it was amazing, right? Sort of
Yeah. So
breakthrough.
that misalignment often exists, right? And you sort of have to know where you fit into the bigger picture, right? And to be in an advisory role like that and supporting the business, right?
Yeah,
Without the sales, without the top line, there's no need for a supply chain, right? I tell people that
right.
all
But
the
also, I mean,
time.
sometimes I would say, hey, look, if you call this too high and it's not if it's more what we think and less about what your target is, here's the inventory implications. And so, guess what? As a person, as a general manager, she's managing the sales and the profits and the inventory and the obsolescence. And so, you know, so there are times when she would say, you know what, let's bring it down to a lower level than target. I'll manage it, uh, and then we armed her with the information so she could talk through this properly because everyone's got someone they've got to work with and be pressurized by. So
Right, right. Okay, so that's sort of the end of corporate, and then you make this shift. I still remember seeing when you made the move, saying, "Oh, what's John up to now?" But you went into the academic world, right? Into academia, I guess. And what precipitated that? what drove you to make that decision at that point in your career to leave the corporate world and begin teaching?
Yeah, and by the way, it was a huge decision, right? I was thinking to myself, this is either going to be like the best decision or the stupidest decision in my life, right? It turned out it worked out pretty good, but I had experience doing some teaching, right? So I was an adjunct professor. When I was working for Diageo for a little bit, I was an adjunct professor at Rutgers when I was at Estee Lauder, and even at Honeywell, right? When we were working on integrated business planning, we called it SIOP. Did a lot of training, a lot of like, again, just like we talked about with some of the work that we did together, right? You know, you don't want to fool with the tool. You want people to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it and how to do it, right? So the investment in the people that we spent at Honeywell was huge, right? And every time I would do those kinds of things, I would say, boy, it feels really good to help somebody else to do well, right? You achieve your own personal success, right? And I did a fair bit of that, right? But giving back and helping others was something that kind of had a different inner motivation. So I left Estee Lauder. My friends were like, so wait, you're leaving? Like, where are you going? I said, well, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to another company. And they would always say, well, I know you can't tell anybody, but tell me, where are you going? What other company are you going to?
Right.
It's like, no, I'm not going anywhere. But I ended up at Rutgers full time. And warping young children's minds, all the time, right? It's definitely a lot of fun.
Yeah, here I want to plug Rutgers because they have one of the best supply chain programs. Consistently, I believe, in the top 5 in the graduate program as well as the undergrad program. So, super great school for an experienced person like you to go to and really help them, raise their game out in the academic market there. So, I should point out Rutgers has got a great reputation. Everybody thinks of Michigan State or some of the other ones about supply chain schools, but Rutgers has a very, very solid reputation.
Yeah, I think we academically we're strong, and we have practitioners as well as folks who are deep theorists, and then we also partner with companies as well, right? So that helps a lot. Just kids can go out and young women, men and women, should say kids, right? I think of my kids, right? But they can get internships, they can get jobs. The market is here, right? So yeah, it's really enjoyable, and I teach undergrad and I teach graduate students, and so that's also very different, right? People who have experience or people who are just starting into business, there's different approaches as well.
Yeah, let's talk about it though, because when we were prepping for this, you said that you like to take them back to the sort of the foundational concepts or foundational building blocks of supply chain. Explain the theory that you have behind that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a sports guy, right? So, like many other folks, you can do all the I'm a soccer guy, so you can do all the flashy moves, but if you can't control the ball, if you can't pass the ball, right? Some basic stuff, right? All the flashy stuff doesn't really help you that much, right? So starting with the basics is important. So introduction to supply chain, what is distribution? What is production, right? How do you manage suppliers? How does this whole thing work together? It's important, right? Because you can start talking about terms, but what does it mean, right? So like sometimes with the undergraduates, I can talk about ordering, like, we can talk about MRP, we can talk about DRP, we can talk about reorder point and, all these other things, right? Bills of materials, of course, people know that. You can learn what a bill of material is. You can learn what MRP is, right? But then you ask a more fundamental question, right? Like, how do you know when it's time to order? Right. And I'll pause just like we paused there, and, you sort of get that look on your face, and you're like, well, the bill of material and the MRP, no, like, how do you know when to order, right? Like, well, so then you start breaking it down. You're like, well, I want to order now so I don't run out later by the time it shows up. Like, so, just different ways of sort of approaching these things. I think it unlocks a different level of thinking, right? Because you don't want your supply chain talent, right? In this case, future supply chain talent to just go, yeah, I know how to, I use SAP, we run the MRP, the output pops out, and then I I push the order button, right? That there's no thinking there, right? Versus, oh, why did it order this? Well, that's a funny result. Why did this order? Oh, somebody changed the lead time from 2 weeks to 20 weeks. Somebody fat fingered a number there.
Mm-hmm.
It's the wrong answer, but I know how to pick it up. I know what it's doing, right?
Right. So you're teaching them the drivers, right, of what I remember inventory, right? Safety stocks to cover variation in demand over the lead time, right? And I'll never forget that, by the way. But it's good to know the why behind it. So when you see those anomalies happen, you're like, well, what variable that I just entered here could have caused that sort of a result, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Knowing the cause and effect.
absolutely. Right. And then, so we'll do a thing on inventory. We'll talk about safety stock. And by the way, most people get safety stock, right? And then you say, well, what's cycle stock? And you get fewer people who maybe are really sharp on that, even at the grad level, people who've been, doing supply chain. It's like, well, that's based on how much you order, right? If you order, 1,000, guess what? You got 1,000. And if you're only using 100 a week, you got 10 weeks of extra inventory because you ordered a lot. Like,
Mhm.
okay. So, and then you can sort of take it a little further and say, okay, well, how do you reduce inventory? Well, okay, I can order a smaller quantity. Okay, well, how does that work, right? And how does your supplier feel about that? Maybe they don't care. And by the way, we did that at Honeywell. We looked at, we did one thing for inventory management. We said anything where we're ordering more than 6 months worth of inventory, it's probably too much, right? This wasn't an optimized, parameter. It was like, if we're ordering more than 6 months worth, let's see if we can reduce that quantity.
Right.
We did, right? And I remember talking with the procurement folks, and they're like, listen, we already negotiated this stuff, and if we're going to go back and change the quantities, we're going to actually have price increases. I was like, well, we can figure out the inventory trade-off versus the purchase price trade-off. But they would come back and they go, oh yeah, actually, like 90% of the suppliers just said, yeah, we can change the order quantity, and there was no impact. Right? We just got less cycle stock, and it just took us, understanding where the inventory driver was, and then trying to think a little bit about how to work on that. So
Right. That's you just triggered something in my head about how often do most corporations like sort of go visit or revisit, I guess, the order quantities and some of these factors that you're talking about here that drive inventory. I sometimes I think people set it one time and then never go change it again,
pretty
right?
much.
Over
Yeah.
the life cycle of the product, and that could change, right? You could be running artificially high inventory unnecessarily if
Yeah.
your supplier built a factory a lot closer to you and the lead time's a lot shorter, and you can get it, weekly milk runs, right? Why would you
Yeah.
keep 4 weeks worth, right?
Yeah. And exactly like to your point, right? Half the time it's like, well, when did we update this last? It was like, oh, when we first launched the product, we were selling a million units a year. Now we're selling, a tenth of that. Well, we can change, right? But
Right.
but which also begs the question, okay, exactly to your point, right? Let's put some reviews periods in there every year at least, even, right? That's
Yeah.
not too onerous to say once a year, let's go look at this stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. Very cool. So you've talked about inventory optimization. Demand planning's hot, right? That's a pretty popular topic these days. Integrated business planning, IBP, or
Mm-hmm.
you've already mentioned SIOP, which is sales and operations planning, but drop in that extra I for inventory, sales
Yep.
inventory and optimism and operations planning. So are those the real areas of interest these days when either when you're teaching or when you're out consulting with any clients?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that. I think most companies, that I'll talk to, right? If it's an ongoing concern, right? It's doing all the supply chain stuff that it's got its partner set up, it's got its manufacturing and distribution set up, right? And somebody's planning it, right? So, there's always opportunities to improve planning of any one of those elements. But because things are so complex, right? You almost need to step back and say, okay, so what, right? So we have a forecast for this new product. We got a production plan for this new product, but is this a good plan, right? And so, that discussion, right, which is usually how integrated business planning does it, right, is saying like, okay, we made the detailed plans. Now let's sort of scope up a little bit and see what that's telling us. And there's so much value, I think, for companies to do that, right? It's like, and sometimes it's, well, okay, we got a new product and we overcooked the sales forecast a little bit, and we didn't really tell anybody. We just put the number in, and then somebody knew that, there's a new product, so they overcooked the safety stock and the inventory plan a little bit, and somebody overcooked the production plan a little bit, and somebody overcooked the materials plan a little bit, and nobody really talked about it. But boy, we put a lot of extra stuff in that launch. So there's things like that. Or, sometimes it's like, well, what happens if, right? I mean, like, tariffs are a class example right now. Like, this tariffs were coming. If you paid attention, right, you knew something was coming, right? Now, maybe you didn't know the magnitude, but, people had discussions about, well, what if this happens? What if that happens, right? And, things are still playing out. So understanding, like, what you do in different scenarios, or how do you sort of either chart a middle course or pick one of those or have a plan B. I mean, that's all part of that integrated business planning. And things are much, less certain than they were 20 years ago, right? Across supply chains and everything else, right? We talk about VUCA, right? The whole volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. So, having those discussions is necessary. It's absolutely paramount, or else you're going to go forward with your plans and then just run into a brick wall.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay, so that's hot. Now, what other? So there's a lot of other hyped up things in the supply chain world. I always like to ask people, sort of, what are some of the myths out there? If you want to maybe pop a few, be a myth buster here, pop a few balloons. Like, is there anything out there in supply chain that you're seeing that's probably a fantasy at best?
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, things change, right? So, what maybe was a fantasy 20 years ago, maybe reality now. But I would say that one thing that I see a lot is people talk about sort of end-to-end supply chain visibility, right? End-to-end, transparency. And I want to have all these things. You know what? The customer sneezes and the supplier hands him a tissue before he even knows it, right? That kind of stuff. But, to me, right, supply chains are super complex, right? And there's so many things going on that, can you look at the whole supply chain, at once? Not really. And even if you put all your database into, all the data, all the stuff into, the best control towers and all these, things, dashboards, et cetera, you one person or even like a small group of people can't direct all of those things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's just too much stuff going on. Like, well, what's going on with the supplier? What's going on with our inventory? What's going on with the in-transit? What's going on with our in our logistics from the supplier? What's going on with our distribution? What's going on with, happening in this part of the world, that part of the world? So I think that's kind of a myth, right? Now, I mean, you still need to control the whole supply chain, right? You still need to have the whole supply chain work together. But, to me, more the answer is saying, hey, look, I know how these components work, right? And this component works well, and also it plugs into these other two components, right? And therefore, I've set some rules of engagement on how these functions work, and then now I can make sure that this component works by itself. There's excellence in production or logistics or warehousing or what have you. But then I can think about those building blocks, that work well by themselves, and I can put them together in sort of a string, and I'll get the right result. So,
Nice.
yeah. So, but end-to-end visibility, or certainly end-to-end control. I mean, even in a relatively small business, it can quickly get out of one person's ability to manage.
Right. There's just too much variability, right? I mean, to me, I always think of supply chain as managing that variation as best as possible. Eliminate it wherever you can, but it's really about planning for the fact that things aren't always going to go as planned, and
Yeah.
you need to be ready for that and make those adjustments,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. But I mean, also some of that stuff comes to the fundamentals, right? I can trust my logistics partner. I've got a third party logistics partner. I can trust them to deliver. I've got reports on them. Do I need to micromanage them? No, right? If I want to see what's going on with any given load on any given day, I could click into it, but I'm not controlling it. They're controlling it, right? I mean, that's why we have, third party logistics. It's been around forever, right? So,
Right.
um, but although there's other things that are kind of interesting too, right? Which I've started to just also break some of my own ideas and paradigms, right? So I spent a lot of time doing planning, supply chain planning, and a student came up to me recently, maybe 2 years ago, and they said, "I read this article where supply chain planning can be fully automated, it can be hands off, right?" And I thought to myself, God, that's total BS. You can't do that. Like, I almost took it personally, right? You
Right.
gotta have the understanding of the business and the market, and you gotta make the good production decisions under uncertainty. And then, I checked myself and I was like, actually, right, a lot of supply chain management and a lot of supply chain planning, decision making is based on rules, right? You know, oh boy, how do I figure out how much to ship to the warehouse? Well, they tell me the requirements, and I try to fill the safety stock, and then I get those raw requirements, and I put them into a truckload, and off it goes. Well, there are rules to that. So when you have rules, right? When you have something that's repeatable process with decisions and stuff, you can automate a lot of that, right?
Right.
There's some exceptions, maybe you can't, but there's a lot that you can. So actually, I actually wrote an article a little while ago talking about third party planning, right? And by the way, it was totally. I did a conference and people were up in arms. I went to a planning conference, right? And I talked to them about, hey, we can have somebody else outside do the planning, and they were up in arms, like, no, this is our job. And I was like, well, no. First of all, you're not going to lose your job. You still need to control your business. You only know the ins and outs of your business, but you can
Right.
get help, right? Just like third party logistics, just like third party manufacturing, you can get support and expertise in whatever it is, forecast modeling or, inventory optimization or, right? So, so actually, at the end, I think I got some traction on that one, but that was, something that, oh, we have to plan our own business, well, we can do the logistics, have someone else do the logistics, but we have to do the forecasting. Well, maybe not. Maybe not.
Right. Yeah. I was in the outsourcing business before I came to Tenzing, and we actually, with some of our manufacturing clients, we were managing certain inventory positions, right? Just making sure the supplies were there to that they weren't gonna, have any lines go down. And they saw that as, okay, that's something we can give you guys. It's really just checking on these positions, calling suppliers, making sure the material's on the way, validating some things, maybe changing some purchase orders around. But yeah, so it's always a question of what should be core, what should we do. So you're getting near it, so I got to ask, there are logical steps and calculations and decisions driven by those calculations, and all of this screams, oh, AI. um,
Yeah.
so what is the play maybe for artificial intelligence, and maybe specifically, I'll say, agentic artificial intelligence in the supply chain world?
Yeah, it definitely is a role, right? And I think back, before, yeah, maybe let's say 4 years ago, when AI was not clearly quite as didn't get as much, press as it does today, and everyone's like, "I'm so busy." I talk to every supply chain manager, and they're like, "I'm busy. I'm super busy." Right? They keep, guess what? Companies aren't adding, they're adding more products. They're not taking away products, adding more products. They're adding more suppliers, more complexity, right? More
Yes.
channel partners. So to some extent, you need that relief, right? People talk about productivity, and yes, but it's almost like a relief valve for people who are overloaded now. Um, but I think where you see the success is exactly where you got structured processes, where you got decision making. Was like, hey, you know what? I can tell the AI agent, in this situation do this, in that situation do this, right? And guess what? Companies that have worked on the fundamentals, that know their business really well, right? That have set up process-based solutions, they're going to be successful, right? Companies that don't have that, well, Greg does it this way and John does it this way and Mary does it that way. Boy, how do you tell an AI agent to say, well, go talk to Greg and see how he's feeling today. Greg's kind of grumpy before he gets his coffee, so make sure you always call, talk to him. He makes this different decisions before 9 and after 10, that
Right.
doesn't work, right? So, but there's a huge role, right? And by the way, there's also incumbent on us to like know our supply chains, know how we make those decisions, right? Decisions by gut feel are hard to automate, right? Decisions that you can sort of talk about and understand make more sense.
Right. Right. Okay, so it's going to be, you still need some human in the loop, right? Probably
Yeah.
just like everywhere AI is being applied to sort of look at things, to size up the situation, let the AI make some decisions, but somebody's got to be checking it to make sure it doesn't hallucinate or go rogue.
For
True.
sure, for sure. Yeah, and like simple, yeah, like I was talking about AI. I was doing some research on AI agents and procurement, and it was like, oh wow, I want to know. And guess what? It was like if the material is late, you send an email. The AI agent will send an email to the supplier and say, hey, you're late. What happened? And respond on when you're going to provide that time. Makes perfect sense. You really can't. I mean, I guess you could screw it up, but that's you could make that pretty bulletproof, right? So great. If you're a materials manager and you're making calls to suppliers, you don't need to make the calls anymore, right? Now, like understanding what's going on with the supplier and having a relationship and understanding, they might be on point of bankruptcy or, there's another competitor who they're also supplying, right? Those kinds of nuances, right? It's going to be very hard to really get AI agents to do that kind of thinking and intuition and sort of navigation through those scenarios.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so there's a place for it. Are your students, all jazzed up about the AI potential, or is it still, you're still teaching more of the fundamentals, and that'll come later?
So I think a couple of things. One is you have to have the fundamentals. If you don't know what's really happening, if you don't know why you're ordering this or that, or you're selling this or that, or how things get produced, right? You have no hope, right? Because you know you're just if you're just somebody who just follows the numbers, well, the AI agent is going to follow the numbers better than you, right? So you have to have that sort of knowledge, right? Not just of a bit of the supply chain, but also the broad view, right? But because that's how you're going to add value, right? I can direct an AI, right? I can tell it if it's going wrong or right. I can oversee it, right? So you have to have that basic understanding, or even further than that.
Right.
But then I think there's probably a mix. I think you hear a lot of people saying that AI is going to take jobs. We're not nearly there yet, right? I think it's more about supporting the workload that's there. And contrary to some reports, people are like, oh, it's hard for students to get jobs now. Well, it's not really AI driven. Um, but also, I'd say that most of us hear a lot about AI, right? We kind of hear people talking and touting AI or talking about wins from AI, but I don't think a lot of us have been exposed to AI, right? You know, I mean,
Right.
I've just started doing some AI work recently, but I'm new to this stuff, right? So, if you're just the average person in a supply chain or in a business, you haven't set up an AI agent, you know. Maybe you're starting to use one that was set up now and you're just learning, right? So with anything like that, there's always some fear and trepidation. And then, we'll be sitting here 5 years from now doing another podcast, Greg, and we'll be talking about, how easy it is. And, boy, this company's came in and, you just set up an AI agent in minutes, right? Versus, the weeks it takes now, right? Or longer.
Yeah, the difference will be in 5 years. It'll be my digital twin talking to your digital twin, and you know, uh, you know, we both might have more hair or something like
That's right.
that.
We'll look that much better, right?
Right? Yeah. So, one thing I want to ask you is, let's just imagine you got plucked out of academia. Some
Okay.
company was starting up, and they said, "Look, we need a chief supply chain officer. We love your mix of academic theory as well as your corporate experience. You sort of are in touch with what the next generation of people are coming out. So we want to bring you on board, and you're starting with a clean sheet of paper. What do you do? What do you do first as a new chief supply chain officer in today's world?
Hmm. Hmm. So, I mean, I think there's always the chance to learn, right? I mean, and if you're not learning, right, that there's an issue there. If you come in with the solutions already, pre-planned in your head, that's a problem. But I think that for me, the first thing is you understand what makes a business successful, right? What's the business model? How are we competing? What, is it, new introductions and variety of products? Is it being a cost leader? Is it, the lead time or additional customer service? Because, that's going to guide your focus, right? I mean, if you're constantly having a variety of products and you're introducing it, well, you need to be able to have, agile supply chains that, manufacturing that can move from one product family to another, one SKU to another. So I think there's each supply chain serves its business, right? It serves the business today, right? With the capabilities today. And then it's going to serve the business tomorrow with capabilities that you can put in over time, right? So I think, rather than say, hey, you know what, I always go in and look at manufacturing, I always go and look at this. I would want to start by talking to my commercial partners and my financial partners. Hey, what's making us successful today? What's going to make us successful in the future? And then you start either shifting your capabilities, strengthening your existing capabilities, or building new ones that may not exist. But I think that always seems to work out well. If you come in with a playbook from a different time, it doesn't work. I've seen companies that are growing and then they become mature, right? And they struggle because the playbook didn't work anymore, right?
Right.
Or whatever that might be, or, oh boy, we keep having the same, we're trying to compete on cost, but actually the customer really wants more variety right now, or they want more personal touch, right? Whatever that might be. I think that's where I would start.
Okay. Yeah, I think you hit on something there, which is really understand the business model and understand what they're trying to achieve. I've seen companies be successful too when they sort of have empathy for the customer, right? What is the end user experience? I'll take Dick's Sporting Goods here in Pittsburgh, right? They do a lot of fulfillment. I don't know the exact number, but they do a lot out of the stores, right? So they look at the
Mm-hmm.
stores as an extension sort of their distribution network, and their service is, hey, I want to take care of the athlete, right? That's the customer in their parlance. And if we can ship something to Anderson, I don't know if I consider me an athlete, but um,
Weekend
everybody that's a
warrior.
customer is an athlete. So if we can serve Anderson out of the Cranberry Township store, right, where we've got what he needs in inventory for this online order he just placed, because they go omni-channel, right? But they don't restrict their omni-channel to a bunch of in the back end a bunch of singular channels. It's all one big system, and they find the best place to fulfill from. And so their store associates are often filling orders out of the store to improve the customer experience. And I think that's a good example of understanding your market, understanding what that market needs, thinking with empathy for that customer, and trying to get something as the most satisfying experience, right? If you use that channel,
Yeah,
right?
and you already have inventory, you already have employees, right? I mean, you've got some capabilities that you can leverage. Yeah, it's a great
Yeah,
point.
yeah. So it's different, but it makes all the sense in the world when you think about it, right?
Yeah,
Why would I ship from a DC when I have something right in the guy's backyard? Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. Well, John, look, this has been a great conversation. If people are interested in you, I assume you're out there on LinkedIn,
Yep,
John Hellriegel. John, you do some consulting, I believe, as an expert
I do.
in
I
your
do.
downtime. And he's also a great professor at Rutgers. How many years have you been at Rutgers now?
It's been 7 years now. I can't believe it, but time flies when you're having fun.
That's great. That's great. Well, listen, I really appreciate you coming on today to talk to us about your experiences. I think you've got a really unique career background. That's one of the things that intrigued me, and it's always great to catch up with business buddies, if you will, who I've worked with in the past. And I think we always had a good working relationship. You were very fair and balanced, and I appreciate that. So thank you for sharing your expertise with our audience here on the Executive Edge podcast. And I really wish you well with everything. Sounds like you've tapped into something that's really, you know, really putting you in a happy place, and I'm happy for you. I'm grateful to have you here
Yeah.
today, and I'm happy you're doing so well. So thank you, John.
Thank you, Greg. It's been great catching up.
Yeah, you take care, man.
All
Until
right.
next time.